The scream cut through my apartment like a torn seam, and I sat up before I knew I'd moved. The clock blinked 12:04, a red wound in the dark. I listened, counting heartbeats, and the sound came again from the closet, thin and sharp. I said, "Hello," and my voice sounded borrowed. The air tasted like dust and metal, as if the room had been locked for years. Boards creaked with small, deliberate weight. I slid my feet to the cold floor and felt grit gather under my toes. The knob was cool, as if something breathed on the other side. I said, "If someone's in there, this is not funny." Silence answered, patient and pleased. I tugged the door, and a hiss of stale air rolled over me. On the shelf, in a shoebox, a porcelain doll watched with bright blue eyes. I knew I had never owned it. I said, "Where did you come from?" And the light from the hall bent toward its face. The pupils gleamed like wet ink. The apartment thinned around me, as if it leaned to listen. A tiny scrape sounded, ceramic on cardboard, and the doll's head turned a fraction toward my breath. I told myself sleep would erase it, yet morning felt brittle like a plate glued wrong. Sunlight washed the room but skipped the closet, as if light forgot how to land. I made coffee and waited for steadiness to arrive. I said, "It was stress," and the words rang hollow. Dust showed a neat path of tiny prints from the closet to my bed. The sheets bore a faint crease at the edge, the shape of knees that were not mine. I cleaned the floor and watched the prints reappear like a slow confession. The doll now sat on the dresser with hands folded, head lifted. I did not remember moving it. I said, "You were in the box," and quiet answered with a smile I could not see. The mirror caught me staring and returned a face I almost believed. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke, like an attic that learned to breathe. I called Mark, because logic in another voice can feel like shelter. Mark said, "You need sleep, not ghost stories." I laughed too quickly, and he heard it. He promised to swing by after work and bring a rational hammer. I said, "Bring two." The day dragged like a wet coat. Every reflective surface seemed crowded by a second shape, a blink behind mine. In the office restroom, the lights flickered with my breath. I held the counter and waited for the hum to settle. Mark texted a string of sarcasm that almost felt warm. I checked my pocket and found a house key I knew belonged on the hook. I said, "I didn't move you," to the key, and the key stayed quiet. The elevator doors closed on a ghost of my face and opened on the same ghost again. On the walk home, wind pushed litter like little running feet. My phone chimed with a voicemail from Elaine. Elaine said, "I cleaned out some old things, call me when you can." Her voice wore its practiced brightness. I knew the rooms behind it. I said, "I'm fine," to the empty street, and the street shrugged. The apartment welcomed with the smell of rain and dust. Frames on the wall faced backward, glass to the plaster, my own image hidden from the room. I touched one and felt a cold stripe through the nail. The closet door leaned a degree open, the gap a mouth mid-word. I said, "Not now," and the light in the hall dimmed like a blink. The doll waited on the dresser with the patience of furniture and grief. I set the phone on the nightstand and decided to sleep with the closet closed. The door clicked like a reluctant tooth. I said, "Tomorrow I deal with this," and slid under the sheet. The building sighed as pipes cooled. I counted 10 breaths, then the latch ticked once and held. The air thinned and pressed, as if the room took a long, careful sip. I heard a tiny scrape across cardboard. The lamp flickered without failing. I said, "Stay where you are," and my voice forgot how to rise. A lullaby pushed through the wall, a tune I didn't know I knew. The doll's eyes gleamed in the dark like spilled stars. The door eased open a sliver, and the night stepped closer with soft, deliberate feet. Morning light crept over the blinds, but the room still felt weighted. Jessica moved slowly, each step cautious as though the floor might betray her. The closet sat closed, yet its silence carried weight. On the dresser, the porcelain doll no longer slumped, but sat upright, its hands folded neatly in its lap. Jessica whispered, "You weren't there last night," though no answer came. She sipped coffee that tasted faint, waiting for calm, but her eyes never left the folded hands. Dust clung to its lace, shimmering like frost. Jessica blinked once, and the doll's head seemed straighter than before. She pulled her sweater tighter, the air cold despite sunlight. The house's rhythm felt off, as though each tick of the clock dragged a beat too long. The apartment smelled faintly of smoke, though no candle burned. Jessica said, "You stay put," as though warning a child, and walked away without turning her back. Mark arrived by late afternoon, his easy grin already tugging at her fear. He teased, "You're letting an old toy scare you?" Jessica forced a smile, though her eyes clung to the doll. Mark lifted it, laughing as he placed it back into the closet shoebox. Jessica said, "Don't mock this." He shrugged, brushing dust from his hands. A sudden metallic click drew their attention as the front door chain lifted, fell, and clattered again. Jessica froze. Mark said draft, though no wind stirred. Jessica whispered, "There isn't one." Her chest tightened while Mark forced another laugh. The doll's gaze peeked through a slit of light in the closet, as though it had not been boxed at all. Jessica's breath slowed until she felt she might suffocate. Mark said, "See? Nothing." Yet the silence afterward was not empty, but watching. Sleep dragged Jessica into a dream that felt older than memory. A child's lullaby hummed low in a language her tongue almost recognized. She stood in a dark hallway, walls dripping with pale shadows. At the end, a tiny figure turned its porcelain head, and the sound became louder, sharp with hunger. Jessica whispered, "Who are you?" And the figure tilted closer. She awoke sweating, the sound still ringing faintly in her ears. From the closet came a measured tapping, fingernails on wood, steady and deliberate. Jessica sat upright, sheets clutched in her fists. She said, "Stop," but the rhythm grew faster. She pressed her palms to her ears, yet the taps bled through the silence. The lamp flickered once, then steadied, as though daring her to open the door. She stared at the knob, waiting for it to turn. At work the next day, Jessica found no refuge. The fluorescent lights hummed erratically, blinking each time she exhaled. Her reflection in the darkened monitor showed her posture a moment late. Jessica leaned closer and whispered, "Not here." A shape flickered at her shoulder, gone when she turned. Colleagues passed, unaware, while her computer screen briefly showed two login names stacked over each other. She rubbed her eyes and forced herself to type, though her hands trembled. The office air was thick with ozone, sharp and metallic. Jessica muttered, "You don't belong," but the second reflection smiled wider than she did. The lights steadied at last, yet she felt them watching still. A colleague asked if she was all right, and Jessica only nodded, clutching her coffee tighter. Jessica returned home to a silence sharper than before. Frames on the wall were turned backward again, their glass against plaster. She touched one and whispered, "Why me?" But no voice replied. The air in the hallway trembled, as if every breath waited. She entered the bedroom and froze. Every photo frame faced the wall, her smile erased from memory. Jessica whispered, "You can't take me away." From the closet came the faintest sigh, a draft like lungs at rest. The doll now sat on the nightstand, its lace collar tilted, head angled toward her side of the bed. Jessica's hand shook as she reached for the light. She said, "Stay away," but the bulb flickered without dimming. The apartment exhaled a sound of glass shifting, and Jessica stepped back, heart pounding in her ears. Jessica searched the library archives, her hands trembling as she scrolled through brittle microfilm. The story of a missing child appeared again and again, tied to her building decades ago. She whispered, "This isn't coincidence." Reports spoke of a small girl vanishing from her bedroom, the only clue a shattered doll left on the floor. The family moved, and whispers of haunting followed every tenant after. Jessica's throat tightened as she traced the date, only a few years before her family moved into another city. The coincidence sharpened into something sharper, almost deliberate. She muttered, Why here? And the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed harder, as though the pages themselves bristled. A librarian passed behind her, but Jessica swore she felt the air change, heavy and watchful. The photograph on the screen showed a porcelain doll with blue eyes. Her pulse stumbled. The same eyes sat now in her bedroom. Jessica called Elaine, her voice clipped, demanding answers. Elaine paused before speaking. We moved often for reasons I couldn't tell you. Jessica pressed harder, asking, what did you hide? The silence before her mother spoke felt endless. Elaine said, we had reasons, and that's all I'll say, her tone sharp with warning. Jessica's hand clenched around the phone as though she could squeeze the truth out. She whispered, you knew about this, but the line went dead. The call ended with static, though Jessica hadn't heard the click of disconnection. She stared at her reflection in the darkened screen across the room, seeing her face pale and foreign. She said, you left me blind, her voice breaking. The shadows in the corners of her apartment stretched longer as the air cooled, as though the building itself heard their argument and took sides. Jessica pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging. Jessica froze as she entered the kitchen. The porcelain doll sat on the table, its head raised, a tiny burned ribbon knotted around its wrist. Jessica whispered, that wasn't there before. She reached out, then pulled back, afraid to touch. The ribbon's charred edge gave off the faint smell of smoke, though nothing burned nearby. She remembered childhood nights when she woke coughing, her mother insisting it was only dust. Jessica said no. It was you. The doll stared blankly, but its posture felt purposeful, hands placed carefully on the tablecloth. The overhead light buzzed once, dimmed, then steadied as though acknowledging her discovery. Jessica pushed the chair back, wood scraping loud in the silence. Her voice cracked when she said, what do you want? The apartment gave no answer, but the ribbon seemed to pulse faintly like a heartbeat. Mark arrived carrying equipment, his face set with determination. He unpacked motion sensors and a baby monitor, insisting, we'll prove it's nothing but nerves. Jessica's reflection in the darkened window lagged behind, watching her longer than it should. She said, it isn't in my head, her voice tight. Mark placed the monitor by the closet door, wires trailing across the floor. Jessica avoided the mirror's edge, unsettled by the echoing face. Mark smiled, trying to lighten the air, but his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the sensor. Jessica whispered, it waits until the lights go down. Mark replied, then we'll catch it tonight. The hum of the devices filled the apartment, but beneath it, Jessica heard a faint rhythm, like breathing behind the walls. She touched her arm where the air grew colder, and the reflection in the glass blinked slower than she did. The apartment was silent, except for the faint static hiss of the baby monitor. Jessica sat on the bed, her arms around her knees, watching the green light blink steadily. At first there was nothing, only the hum of machines. Then a sound slipped through, a whisper shaping her name, syllables stretched too long. Jessica's stomach clenched. Mark leaned closer, muttering, it's interference. The whisper repeated, this time stronger, unmistakable. It rolled from the monitor like a lullaby warped by hunger. Jessica whispered, it knows me. Her heart pounded as the sound of her name grew clearer, insistent. Mark's jaw tightened, his disbelief cracking. He said, that's not possible. But the voice said her name again, slow and deliberate. Jessica stared at the closet door, its edge a shadow within a shadow. The voice from the monitor coiled around her ears like a cold hand. Jessica carried the doll to an antique shop that smelled of wood polish and dust. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Whittaker, who studied the porcelain face with a gaze too calm. Jessica said, can you tell me what this is? Mrs. Whittaker traced a finger along the doll's cracked cheek, her expression unreadable. She murmured, some vessels hold more than porcelain. They carry what should not be kept. Jessica felt her stomach turn as she asked, what do you mean? Mrs. Whittaker only smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the doll. The air in the shop felt heavier, as though the walls themselves pressed closer. Jessica whispered, it's watching me. Mrs. Whittaker replied, "It is waiting." The words cut through the quiet like a bell. Jessica gripped the counter to steady herself, her palms damp. A clock ticked slowly behind them, each second dragging too long. Mrs. Whittaker lifted the doll gently, her eyes narrowing. She said, "Closets are not only for storage, they are thresholds." Jessica blinked, confused, and whispered, "Thresholds to what?" Mrs. Whittaker leaned closer, her voice low between here and the places that want entry. Jessica felt her skin crawl. She asked, "And the doll?" Mrs. Whittaker's lips curved into something between pity and warning. "It is a key and a door. It may be seeking a body that fits." Jessica's breath hitched, her heart pounding louder than the clock on the wall. She whispered, "Mine," and Mrs. Whittaker nodded once without speaking. The doll's head shifted slightly in her hands, a scrape of porcelain echoing in the shop's stillness. Jessica stepped back, her voice breaking. "I don't want it." Mrs. Whittaker only whispered, "It already wants you." Jessica returned home shaken, unable to rest. She rummaged through an old family box stored in the closet, dust rising around her like smoke. Inside, she found hospital bracelets, brittle and yellowed with time. She whispered, "Why would she keep these?" Beneath them was a faded birth announcement, one line blacked out with ink. Jessica's fingers trembled as she pulled free a photograph of two bassinets side by side. Her chest constricted, and she whispered, "Two?" She traced the faded faces with her finger, her stomach tightening. A soft groan of the building echoed, as if in response. Jessica said, "You were never gone," and tears welled in her eyes. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching along the walls like reaching arms. She pressed the photo to her chest, her heart pounding unevenly. The silence felt ready to break at any second. Jessica called Mark, her voice shaking, and told him about what she found. Mark arrived quickly, his rational calm thin but unbroken. He said, "It doesn't prove anything supernatural, Jess. Maybe your mother hid this for her reasons." Jessica's eyes darkened, whispering, "You don't hear it." Mark insisted, "It's stress, and I want you to talk to someone who can help." Jessica shook her head, feeling the cold air thicken around them. Her reflection in the darkened window stood perfectly still while she shifted uneasily. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, saying, "We'll fix this." Jessica muttered, "It listens," her voice nearly breaking. The floor creaked, though no one moved. Jessica pulled away, staring toward the closet, where the door swayed almost imperceptibly. The silence felt sharper than words, like a blade pressed against her skin. Jessica returned to Mrs. Whittaker, desperate for direction. Mrs. Whittaker held out a small wad of thread and salt, wrapped carefully in cloth. She said, "Truth must be spoken. Secrets bind spirits tighter than chains." Jessica asked what truth. Mrs. Whittaker only replied, "The one hidden from you. Speak it, and you may loosen its hold." Jessica clutched the ward, the salt grains faintly sparkling under the light. Her hands shook as she said, "I'm afraid it's already inside." Mrs. Whittaker whispered, "Then fear is its weapon. Claim your place before it does." Jessica nodded, though the weight in her chest felt heavier. She left the shop with the ward pressed to her palm, her breath sharp and shallow. The doll's presence seemed to cling even from afar, its hunger following her into the fading night. Jessica's phone trembled in her hand as Elaine finally answered, her tone cracked and thin. Elaine said, "You were never supposed to know." Jessica's voice wavered. "Know what?" The pause was heavy, filled with decades of silence. Elaine whispered, "You had a twin. She didn't survive." Jessica's breath froze in her throat, her stomach twisting as though the air itself turned sour. She said, "You lied to me," her voice breaking into shards. Elaine murmured, "We buried it to save you from pain, but grief lingers. Spirits cling to what is unspoken." Jessica's chest burned, her vision blurring as the truth poured into her. The doll's eyes flashed in her memory, the blue glass that seemed too alive. She whispered, "It's her." The line hummed with quiet. Elaine too broken to answer. Jessica let the phone fall to the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a locked door. Elaine's confession echoed as Jessica replayed childhood memories. She remembered a night they moved suddenly, her mother whispering lullabies while packing in silence. Elaine's voice over the phone cracked. The doll belonged to her. Jessica whispered, "The one you never named." Elaine said nothing, her silence heavier than words. Jessica's stomach churned as she looked at the doll perched on the dresser, its cracked cheek tilted like a smirk. She said, "It followed us," her voice sharp with realization. Elaine broke into sobs, whispering, "It always wanted what was lost." Jessica closed her eyes, the weight of the revelation pressing her into the chair. Her hands trembled, remembering nights she thought were nightmares but were visits. She whispered, "You brought it here." The silence that followed felt final, as if the past itself had locked its door. Jessica held the birth announcement and photo side by side, her hand trembling as her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "The lullaby was never mine alone." The memory of nights when she woke to a second crib in her dreams burned sharper. The doll's presence felt stronger, almost humming in the corner of the room. Jessica said, "You remember her name," her voice shaking. The monitor on the dresser hissed faintly, and through it came a childlike hum. It was the same lullaby her mother once sang, but doubled, layered like two voices overlapping. Jessica dropped the photo, clutching her chest, her breath shallow. She whispered, "It was always you." The doll's shadow stretched further, its silhouette bleeding into the walls like ink. The unspoken truth bound itself around her, and she felt the room tighten in on her body. Mark arrived with hurried steps, his face pale after seeing Jessica's expression. She showed him the monitor, frozen on a frame, where a small figure stood in the closet beside her sleeping form. Jessica whispered, "She's here." Mark said, "That's impossible," though his voice cracked with disbelief. Jessica pushed the photo into his hands, her words shaking. She was real. They buried her in silence. Mark's eyes flicked to the image on the screen, his throat tightening. He whispered, "Jess, that's not a glitch." Jessica's stomach twisted, her heart racing like a drum beat in her ears. Mark rubbed his face and muttered, "I can't explain this," his voice finally stripped of skepticism. Jessica whispered, "She wants what I have." The doll on the dresser sat unmoving, yet its presence bled through the room, stronger than ever before. Jessica returned to Mrs. Whittaker, her voice trembling with desperation. Mrs. Whittaker studied her with calm pity, saying, "This spirit is not rage alone. It is longing sharpened by silence." Jessica whispered, "She wants my life." Mrs. Whittaker replied, "She wants a place, and you are the closest door." Jessica's hands shook as she gripped the ward, whispering, "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Whittaker leaned closer, her tone soft but firm. "Longing can turn to a blade, Jessica. Speak her name, give her truth, and claim your place, or she will claim it for you." Jessica's heart thudded painfully, her breath shallow. She whispered, "What if I fail?" Mrs. Whittaker's gaze darkened, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Then you will no longer be you." Jessica's chest tightened, her pulse echoing in her ears as she realized the confrontation could not be avoided. Night folded over the apartment like a locked lid, and I cleared the floor with shaking hands. I laid a thread and salt circle around the bed and the closet threshold. I set the doll on the line where carpet frayed to wood. The air cooled until my breath smoked in the lamp glow. I said, "I know what you are," though my voice skittered. The ward Mrs. Whittaker gave me burned cold in my palm. I said the name I had never been taught, the one the photograph suggested. The room paused as if the building held a breath. I felt the floor hum, a pulse rising through the joists and into my ribs. I said, "I will speak, and I will stay," and the hallway light dimmed like an eyelid. The closet darkened into something deeper than shade. The doll turned its face a fraction, as if hearing the door click on the other side of the world. The apartment answered with a groan that moved like tide under the floor. Picture frames trembled and tapped the wall in a slow cadence. I felt the salt ring crisp under my knees like frost. I said the name again, and the hallway went colder, as if a window had opened in the air. The doll tilted, and the closet seams widened into a mouth of stitched shadow. I whispered, "Not one step," though I didn't know who I warned. The lamp halo thinned, its edge fraying into gray. Something pressed from the closet like weather, patient and old. The dust rose and turned in little cyclones around the threshold. I tasted metal, as if a key had been placed on my tongue. I held the ward tight and felt its thread cut my fingers, asking for more truth than I had offered. The air thickened until each inhale felt borrowed. A weight settled on my ribs, not crushing but persuasive. A murmur shaped itself near my ear, the lullaby divided into two braided lines. It promised warmth if I slept and peace if I yielded. I said, "You cannot wear me," and the wardrobe doors creaked in answer. The bed springs sang a faint warning as the mattress dipped without a body. I felt a small palm press the skin above my heart from inside. The salt hissed like wet fire and the thread quivered, holding. I said the name again and added mine beside it, binding both in one breath. Somewhere in the closet, a hinge sighed like someone deciding. The murmurs sharpened into syllables that tried my mouth, testing the fit like a dress. Mark burst in with keys clattering and froze at the circle and the open dark. He whispered, "Jess, what did you do?" But the voice from the closet said my name with his mouth. Mark lunged for the doll, and a force threw him sideways into the dresser. The wood boomed and the lamp shook but did not fall. I shouted, "Leave him!" and the room leaned toward the closet like a tide reversing. Mark gasped, "Keep saying it," his voice ragged. I took his hand across the salt without breaking the line. The drawer slid open by itself and spilled old photos like white leaves. The shadow swelled and then thinned, as if breathing through a tighter throat. I said the name again and told the waiting dark that this body was taken. The thread sang against my fingers like a thin, bright wire. I faced the closet and spoke the name with mine a third time, steady as a pulse. I said, "I see you, and I carry you in truth, not in skin." The air buckled like heat above asphalt, and then snapped cold. The salt line flared and went dark, but it did not break. I named the lullaby, the empty crib, the arrest ink, and the night stolen by silence. I said you were loved, and you are not me, and the apartment trembled like a chord struck deep. The closet narrowed, the mouth sewing itself with shadowed thread. The doll's head drooped, as if sleep finally claimed its porcelain. Mark whispered, "Jess," but did not cross the circle. The pressure lifted from my chest in a long, aching peal. The dark pulled back through the door, and the latch caught with a soft, tired click that felt almost like relief. The silence after the storm felt raw, like skin rubbed too thin. The salt circle lay in ashes, and the threads had burned away. Jessica whispered, "It's over," though the air remained heavy. The doll slumped, lifeless for the first time, its glassy eyes dim. She reached toward it, but pulled her hand back, unsettled by the quiet. The closet door clicked shut on its own, gentle as a sigh. Jessica felt the apartment breathe easier, though a thread of unease remained. Mark touched her arm and whispered, "You're safe now," but her chest knew safety was only borrowed. The next day, Jessica carried the doll in a sealed box to a storage facility. She signed the lock with shaking hands and pressed the door shut. The concrete hall smelled sterile, the air sharp and cold. Jessica whispered, "Stay here," as though the box could hear. The metal door echoed as it latched, a sound that reverberated too long. She breathed in relief, trying to believe distance meant safety. Yet when she turned, the hallway seemed longer than before, shadows stretching toward her steps. Her reflection in the steel walls followed a beat too slow, its smile wrong. Mark urged her to rest and see someone, but Jessica's mind could not quiet. At night she sat with tea, trying to forget the weight of the doll. Yet in the silence she heard soft pacing, as though tiny steps traced the perimeter of her room. She muttered, "You're gone," but the sound didn't stop. Her hand trembled on the cup, tea spilling onto the table like blood spreading. Jessica pressed her palms to her ears, but the steps grew louder, steady as a heartbeat. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You never left." An email from the storage facility arrived days later. Motion detected in Unit 317. Jessica opened the link, her breath shallow. The footage showed only the locked door, yet a shadow shifted across its frame, tall and out of place. She whispered, "It found a way." Her hand hovered over the screen, terrified to watch again. Mark said, "It's just a glitch," but his face betrayed the lie. Jessica stared at the still image, heart pounding as if the shadow might step out of the screen. The silence around her thickened, filled with a waiting hush. That night, Jessica lay in bed, exhaustion dragging her under. The closet latch ticked once, soft as a sigh. A lullaby rose in the dark, sung in perfect time with her heartbeat. She whispered, "No," but her voice broke. The door eased open, the shadows spilling wider across the floor. Jessica pulled the sheet to her chin, her body frozen. The lullaby grew sweeter, curling into her ears like a promise. The air pressed against her chest, patient and claiming. Jessica shut her eyes tight, but the last thing she saw was the doll's blue eyes gleaming in the dark, waiting for her to fall asleep.